Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is exactly what everyone tells him not to do. In the harsh wilderness of Montana's Glacier County, where winter winds cut through a man's soul and wolves still roam the endless plains, one rancher's defiant choice would either save his family's legacy or destroy everything 3 generations had built. When the entire town, the sheriff, his own family, and even his closest friends all said the same thing, stop. Don't do it. Seasoned cattle rancher Jake Morrison looked them all in the eye and did the one thing nobody expected. He ignored every warning, every threat, and every plea. What happened next would become the most talked about story in Montana ranching history, a tale of courage, stubbornness, and the kind of raw determination that built the American West. This is that story. A true account of what happens when a man decides that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the thing everyone else calls wrong. Jake Morrison stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, watching the early morning mist roll across his pasture land like ghostly fingers reaching for something just out of reach. The coffee in his hands had gone cold an hour ago, but he barely noticed. His mind was wrestling with a problem that had been eating at him for weeks, growing bigger and meaner with each passing day. The Morrison Ranch had been in his family for 87 years. His grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had claimed this land back in 1936 when it was nothing but wild grass and wishful thinking. Through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and more droughts than any man should have to endure, the Morrison family had held on to their piece of Montana with the kind of stubborn determination that runs in cowboy blood. Now, at 52 years old, Jake found himself facing the biggest threat the ranch had ever seen. It wasn't drought this time, or falling cattle prices, or even the harsh Montana winters that could freeze a man's hope solid. This threat wore expensive suits and carried briefcases full of legal papers that promised to tear his world apart. The Hartwell Development Corporation had been circling the Morrison Ranch like vultures for the past 6 months. They wanted the land for a massive shopping complex and housing development that would stretch from the main highway clear back to Willow Creek. They had money, political connections, and a legal team that could find loopholes in the 10 Commandments if they needed to. Jake's wife, Sarah, had been the first to spot the danger. She had a sharp mind for business and an even sharper instinct for trouble. When the first letter arrived from Hartwell's lawyers, she had read it 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table with hands that trembled just slightly. "They're not just asking to buy us out, Jake," she had said that evening, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of marriage and shared struggles. "They're laying the groundwork to force us out. This letter talks about eminent domain possibilities and community development priorities. That's lawyer talk for taking our land whether we want to sell or not." Jake had crumpled the letter in his fist, his jaw set in the same hard line that had gotten him through every other crisis in his life. "Let them try. This land belongs to the Morrisons, and it's going to stay that way." But Sarah knew her husband well enough to see the worry in his eyes, even when he tried to hide it behind cowboy pride and stubborn determination. The Hartwell Corporation wasn't some small-time land grabber they could scare off with shotguns and harsh words. These people had the kind of money and power that could turn a man's life upside down before he even knew what hit him. The warnings had started coming from every direction after that first letter. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had been Jake's friend since high school, stopped by the ranch on a Tuesday morning with news that made Jake's blood run cold. "They've been talking to the county commissioners," Tom said, accepting a cup of Sarah's coffee and settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Word is they're planning to have your land rezoned for commercial development. Once that happens, Jake, your property taxes are going to shoot through the roof. They're hoping to squeeze you out financially." Jake's oldest son, Michael, had driven up from Billings the following weekend with his own warning. Michael was a lawyer himself, working for a firm that specialized in property rights, and he understood exactly what the Morrison family was up against. "Dad, these people don't take no for an answer," Michael said as they walked the fence line together, checking for breaks that needed mending. "I've seen them operate before. They start with reasonable offers, then they move to legal pressure, and finally, they use political connections to get what they want. The family that owned the Henderson Ranch outside Great Falls fought them for 2 years and lost everything. Even Jake's younger son, David, who usually stayed out of ranch business and focused on his job at the bank in town, had called with his own concerns. "Dad, I've heard rumors at work. Big rumors. The kind that usually turn out to be true. They're talking about offering you 3 times what the land is worth, but they're also talking about what happens if you don't take it. The pressure had been building for weeks when Jake received the visit that changed everything. Harrison Hartwell himself, the corporation's president and the kind of man who measured success in zeros and decimal points, drove up to the ranch in a black luxury car that looked as out of place on the dirt road as a penguin in a desert. Hartwell was a tall, thin man with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no and meant it. "Mr. Morrison," Hartwell had said, extending a hand that felt soft and cold when Jake reluctantly shook it. "I hope we can discuss this situation like reasonable men." They had sat on the porch, Jake in his work clothes and Hartwell in his expensive suit, while Sarah served coffee and watched every word through the kitchen window. Hartwell's offer was generous enough to make a poor man rich and a rich man wealthy. $4 million for the ranch, the land, and everything on it. Cash. No questions asked. Settlement within 30 days. "That's a lot of money, Mr. Morrison," Hartwell had said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Enough to buy a smaller place and retire comfortably. Enough to set up your sons for life." Jake had looked out across his land, watching his cattle graze in the afternoon sun, and felt something twist in his gut. This wasn't just about money. This was about legacy, family, and the kind of values that couldn't be bought or sold. "Mr. Hartwell," Jake had said finally, his voice steady and calm, "I appreciate your offer, but this land isn't for sale. It never has been, and it never will be." Hartwell's smile had faltered just slightly, like a mask slipping for just a moment before sliding back into place. "I understand your attachment to this place, Mr. Morrison. But I'm afraid you might not understand the full situation you're facing." That was when Hartwell had laid out the truth with the cold precision of a man delivering a medical diagnosis. The county commissioners were already leaning toward rezoning. The state environmental agency was preparing to conduct a study that might find problems with the ranch's water usage. The tax assessor's office was scheduling a complete revaluation of the property. "These things have a way of becoming very expensive, very quickly," Hartwell had said, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Legal fees, compliance costs, penalties for violations you might not even know exist. It adds up, Mr. Morrison. It adds up fast." Jake had listened to every word, his face showing nothing, his hand steady on his coffee cup. When Hartwell finished speaking, Jake had stood up, walked to the porch railing, and looked out at the land his grandfather had claimed with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than the next man. "Mr. Hartwell," Jake had said without turning around, "I think it's time for you to leave." After Hartwell's car disappeared down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, Jake had stood alone on his porch, feeling the weight of what was coming. He knew Hartwell wasn't bluffing. The man had the resources and connections to make good on every threat he had implied. That night, Jake and Sarah had sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they had made every important decision of their married life, and talked until the sun came up. They talked about their children, their grandchildren, and what kind of world they wanted to leave behind. They talked about money and security and the practical realities of fighting a battle they might not win. "We could take the money," Sarah had said at one point, her voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. $4 million, Jake. "We could buy a smaller place, something easier to manage. We could make sure the boys are taken care of." Jake had reached across the table and taken her hand, feeling the calluses and strength that came from 30 years of ranch life. "We could," he had agreed. "But then, what? We spend our golden years knowing we gave up everything Dad and Granddad built because someone with more money told us to?" The final warning had come from his own family. Michael had driven up from Billings with his wife and children for what was supposed to be a pleasant Sunday dinner. But the conversation had quickly turned to the situation with Hartwell Corporation. "Dad, you need to seriously consider their offer," Michael had said as they walked toward the barn after dinner. "I've done some research on these people. They don't lose. Ever. If you fight them, you're going to lose the ranch anyway, and you'll lose it with nothing to show for it but legal bills and heartbreak. David had nodded agreement, his banker's practical mind focused on numbers and bottom lines. "Dad, even if you win the first round, they'll just keep coming back. They have enough money to tie you up in court for years. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you." Even Sarah, who had stood by his side through every crisis they had faced, had looked at him with eyes full of love and worry. "Jake, maybe it's time to think about what's really important. We're not young anymore. This fight could destroy everything we've worked for." But Jake Morrison had been hearing warnings his entire life. He had been warned not to expand the herd during the recession of the early 90s. He had been warned not to invest in new equipment when the bank was reluctant to loan money. He had been warned not to try organic farming methods when everyone said they wouldn't work in Montana. Every time, he had listened to the warnings, weighed the risks, and then done what felt right in his gut. Sometimes he had been wrong, and those mistakes had cost him money and sleep. But, more often than not, his instincts had been right, and the Morrison Ranch had prospered when other operations failed. Now, standing on his porch in the early morning light, watching the mist roll across land that held the bones of his ancestors and the dreams of his children, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He was going to fight. Not with lawyers or political connections or corporate money. He was going to fight the way his grandfather had fought, with determination, hard work, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had built the American West one ranch at a time. The plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks suddenly crystallized into something clear and simple and completely unexpected. It was dangerous, probably illegal in a dozen different ways, and guaranteed to bring every authority in Montana down on his head. It was also the only chance he had to save his family's legacy. Jake Morrison walked back into his house, where Sarah was already starting breakfast, and told his wife about the most desperate, dangerous plan any rancher had ever conceived. When he finished explaining, Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her face pale but her eyes steady. "They're all going to tell you to stop," she said finally. "Everyone. The sheriff, the family, the neighbors. Everyone is going to tell you not to do this." Jake nodded, knowing she was right. What he was planning would bring warnings from every direction, threats from people who cared about him and people who didn't, and probably a jail cell if things went wrong. "I know," he said. "But sometimes a man has to do what feels right, even when everyone else thinks he's wrong." Sarah Morrison looked at her husband, this man she had loved for 30 years, and saw something in his eyes that reminded her why she had married him in the first place. It was the same look he had worn when he proposed to her on a snowy Christmas morning, the same look he had shown when their first son was born, the same expression that had carried them through every challenge their life together had brought. "Then, we do it," she said simply. "Whatever happens, we do it together." Outside, the Montana morning was breaking clear and cold, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to promise something better was coming. Jake Morrison stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the land that meant everything to him, and began to plan the most audacious act of defiance in Montana ranching history. The morning when everything changed started like any other day on the Morrison Ranch, with coffee brewing in the kitchen and Jake checking the weather through the window while Sarah made breakfast. But by the time the sun was fully up, Jake Morrison would cross a line that would make him the most wanted rancher in Montana and set in motion a chain of events that would transform him from a respected member of the community into a fugitive from the law. The call came at 6:30 in the morning. Sheriff Tom Bradley's voice was tight with urgency and something that might have been regret. "Jake, I need you to listen carefully. Hartwell Corporation's assessment team is already on their way to your ranch. They left Helena at 4 this morning with a county official and they'll be at your place within the hour." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had been counting on having at least 3 more days to move the rest of his cattle. Instead, he had less than 60 minutes before a team of officials would arrive expecting to find 800 head of cattle and discovering that more than 600 were missing. "Tom, I appreciate the warning," Jake said carefully, knowing that his old friend was taking a significant risk by making this call. "Jake," Tom's voice carried the weight of 30 years of friendship and the authority of his badge, "whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do it. These people aren't playing games. Hartwell has lawyers, investigators, and enough political pull to make your life miserable for the next 20 years. Take their offer and walk away with something. After hanging up the phone, Jake found Sarah already dressed and ready to go. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, and her face showed the kind of calm determination that comes when a person has moved beyond fear into pure resolve. "How many are left to move?" she asked, pulling on her work boots and jacket. 643, Jake said. "Plus about 50 calves that are too young to travel far." Sarah was quiet for a moment, calculating the impossibility of what they were facing. Moving nearly 700 cattle in less than an hour was beyond difficult. It was impossible. Unless Jake was willing to do something that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. "We're going to have to run them," Jake said, voicing the plan that had been forming in his mind since Tom's call. "All of them, all at once. Straight through the main valley and up into the Devil's Triangle as fast as they'll move." It was the most dangerous cattle drive imaginable. The route to the Devil's Triangle included narrow trails, steep climbs, and passages where a single panicked animal could cause a stampede that would kill dozens of cattle and anyone unfortunate enough to be in the way. But it was also the only chance they had to save the herd before Hartwell's team arrived. Jake and Sarah moved with the efficiency of two people who had worked together for so long that words were unnecessary. While Jake saddled their horses, Sarah gathered supplies, rope, medical kit, flares, and the heavy-duty radio they used to communicate across the ranch's vast distances. They both knew that once this drive started, there would be no going back and no second chances. The cattle were already restless when Jake and Sarah reached the main pasture. Animals have an instinct for sensing human tension, and the herd seemed to know that something unusual was about to happen. Thunder, the prize bull, stood at the edge of the group, his massive head raised and his eyes alert. The breeding cows clustered around him, protecting their calves and watching the approaching humans with wary intelligence. Jake had been moving cattle his entire adult life, but he had never attempted anything like what he was about to do. A normal cattle drive involved careful planning, multiple riders, and controlled movement over familiar terrain. What Jake was planning was closer to controlled chaos, pushing nearly 700 animals up a mountain trail that was barely wide enough for horses, hoping that speed and desperation would overcome the physical limitations of the route. "Once we start," Jake said to Sarah as they positioned themselves at opposite ends of the herd, "we can't stop. If they get spooked or split up, we'll lose them. And if anyone gets hurt, we might not be able to get help." Sarah nodded, her face set in lines of determination that reminded Jake why he had fallen in love with her 30 years earlier. "Then, we better not get hurt," she said simply. The drive began with a series of sharp whistles and shouts that sent the cattle moving toward the far end of the pasture. Jake and Sarah rode hard on the flanks, keeping the animals bunched together and moving in the right direction. The horses seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, responding to the slightest touch of the reins and anticipating their riders' needs with the intelligence that comes from years of partnership. For the first mile, everything went according to plan. The cattle moved steadily across the familiar ground of the main pasture, following trails they had used hundreds of times before. Jake began to hope that maybe, just maybe, this impossible plan might actually work. That hope died when they reached the entrance to the Devil's Triangle and the cattle got their first look at the trail that lay ahead. The passage between two massive rock formations was barely 20 feet wide, with steep walls rising on both sides and a trail that disappeared into darkness and uncertainty. The lead animals stopped so suddenly that the rest of the herd piled up behind them, creating a mass of confused and increasingly agitated cattle. Thunder, showing the intelligence that had made him Jake's prize bull, walked to the front of the group and studied the narrow passage with the careful attention of an animal that had learned to be suspicious of anything new. For a long moment, the entire herd waited while their leader made his decision. Then, without warning, Thunder let out a bellow that echoed off the rock walls and started forward into the passage. The rest of the herd followed, streaming through the narrow opening like water through a dam break. Jake and Sarah rode hard to keep up, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly moving beyond their ability to manage. The trail through the Devil's Triangle was a nightmare of narrow ledges, steep climbs, and hairpin turns that seemed designed to test the courage of both animals and humans. Twice, Jake thought they were going to lose part of the herd when groups of cattle balked at particularly difficult passages. Each time, Thunder somehow managed to lead them through, displaying a combination of intelligence and determination that reminded Jake why the Morrison family had spent 50 years developing this bloodline. Sarah rode like a woman possessed, appearing wherever she was needed most, somehow always in the right place at the right time to turn back strays or encourage frightened animals to keep moving. Her horse was lathered with sweat and breathing hard, but it responded to her commands with the kind of trust that comes from years of mutual respect and partnership. The most dangerous moment came when they reached the Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge barely wide enough for a horse, with 100-foot drops on both sides. Jake had walked this passage many times as a boy, but he had never imagined trying to drive cattle across it. The lead animals stopped again, refusing to venture onto what looked like certain death. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Dismounting from his horse, he walked to the front of the herd and began leading the animals across the ridge on foot. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring him to walk backward while encouraging cattle to follow him across a passage where one wrong step would send both man and beast tumbling to their deaths. But Jake Morrison had been handling cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, and he understood something that most people never learn: cattle will follow a leader they trust, even into situations that terrify them. Step by careful step, Jake led Thunder and the rest of the herd across the Devil's Backbone, talking to them in the low, calm voice he had learned from his grandfather. "Easy, Thunder. Easy, boy. Just follow my voice. That's it. One step at a time. We're almost there." It took 45 minutes to get the entire herd across the ridge, 45 minutes during which Jake never allowed himself to think about the consequences of failure. When the last calf made it to safety, Jake felt his knees go weak with relief and exhaustion. But they weren't safe yet. Behind them, in the distance, Jake could see dust clouds that meant vehicles were approaching the main ranch buildings. Hartwell's assessment team had arrived, and they would soon discover that the Morrison ranch appeared to have lost most of its cattle overnight. The final push to the hidden valleys of the Devil's Triangle required every ounce of strength and determination that Jake and Sarah had left. The cattle were exhausted and increasingly difficult to manage. The horses were struggling with fatigue and the demands of the treacherous terrain. And Jake himself was running on pure adrenaline and stubborn refusal to quit. When they finally reached the concealed entrance to the largest hidden valley, Jake had to stop for a moment to catch his breath and convince himself that they had actually accomplished the impossible. Below them, spread across a natural amphitheater of grassland that was invisible from the outside world, were nearly 700 head of the finest cattle in Montana. Sarah pulled up beside him, her face streaked with dust and sweat but her eyes bright with accomplishment. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, we actually did it." But even as Jake savored the moment of triumph, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. Hartwell Corporation's assessment team would find clear evidence that the Morrison Ranch's cattle were missing. They would demand explanations that Jake couldn't give. And, when those explanations didn't come, they would bring in law enforcement with the authority to search every inch of the ranch. The radio crackled to life with a transmission from the main ranch buildings. One of Jake's hired hands, Bobby Martinez, was trying to reach him with news from the assessment team. "Boss, they're here. 3 men in suits and Sheriff Bradley. They're asking a lot of questions about where you are and where the cattle are. I told them you were checking fence lines in the north pasture, but they want to see the herd count." Jake keyed the radio, knowing that his next words would commit him to a course of action that would change his life forever. "Bobby, tell them the cattle are spread out across the range and it'll take time to gather them for a count." "Buy me as much time as you can." "Roger, boss." But, Jake, they're not acting like people who plan to take no for an answer. As Jake clipped the radio back to his belt, he realized that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer a rancher trying to save his land through legal means. He was a man who had deliberately hidden his assets from court-appointed officials, probably committing several felonies in the process. Sheriff Tom Bradley would figure out what had happened within hours, if he hadn't already. When he did, Jake Morrison would become a wanted man, subject to arrest for obstruction of justice, contempt of court, and probably a dozen other charges that Hartwell Corporation's lawyers would be happy to file. But, as Jake looked down at his cattle, safe and sound in a hidden valley that had protected the Morrison family's livestock for 3 generations, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, understanding as well as her husband that they had just transformed themselves from law-abiding citizens into fugitives. Jake Morrison looked across the hidden valley that held everything he valued most in the world, then turned to face the woman who had stood by him through every challenge their life together had brought. "Now," he said, "we see just how far a man can push the law before the law pushes back." The manhunt for Jake Morrison began exactly 4 hours after Hartwell Corporation's assessment team discovered that the Morrison Ranch appeared to have lost over 600 head of prime cattle overnight. By sunset, there were more law enforcement officers converging on Glacier County than had been seen since the federal raid on the militia compound 15 years earlier. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood in the empty main pasture of the Morrison Ranch, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between duty and friendship. The assessment team had been thorough in their investigation, and their findings painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Jake Morrison had deliberately concealed the vast majority of his livestock to prevent their inclusion in the court-ordered evaluation. "Tom, this isn't some bookkeeping error," said Agent Patricia Wells from the Montana Department of Justice. "We're talking about the calculated theft of assets worth over $2 million. Morrison has committed multiple felonies, and every hour we wait makes it harder to track down those animals." Tom had known Patricia Wells for 12 years, ever since she had been assigned to investigate cattle rustling operations in northwest Montana. She was smart, thorough, and absolutely relentless when pursuing a case. If anyone could track down Jake and his hidden cattle, it would be Patricia Wells. "I know Jake Morrison," Tom said carefully, trying to balance his personal loyalty with his professional obligations. "He's not a criminal. He's a desperate man trying to save his family's land." "Desperation doesn't excuse breaking the law," Wells replied, pulling on latex gloves and preparing to examine evidence that Jake's own hired hands had been forced to provide. "And hiding assets from a court proceeding isn't just desperation. It's a calculated criminal act." The evidence was overwhelming. Boot prints in soft ground showed a pattern consistent with a large-scale cattle drive. Fresh tire tracks indicated that Jake had used vehicles to transport feed and equipment to remote locations. And several of the ranch hands, when pressed by investigators, admitted that Jake had been working unusual hours and moving animals to areas they had never used for grazing before. But the most damning evidence came from Jake's own family. Michael Morrison arrived from Billings within 3 hours of the investigation's beginning, and his lawyer's training made him immediately understand the severity of his father's situation. "Dad's in serious trouble," Michael told his younger brother David when they met at the ranch house. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore. When you deliberately hide assets from a court-ordered assessment, you're looking at federal charges. Contempt of court, obstruction of justice, maybe even racketeering if they decide this was organized crime." David Morrison looked around the kitchen where he had eaten countless family meals, trying to process the idea that his father might spend the rest of his life in federal prison. "Where do you think he took them?" "I have no idea," Michael said, though both brothers knew that wasn't entirely true. They had grown up on this ranch, and they had both explored the Devil's Triangle with their grandfather. If anyone could hide cattle in terrain that would defeat a modern search operation, it would be Jake Morrison. The first search teams reached the edges of the Devil's Triangle as the sun was setting, painting the rocky landscape in shades of gold and red that made the terrain look even more forbidding than usual. Agent Wells had organized the operation with military precision, using helicopter surveillance, ground teams with tracking dogs, and electronic equipment that could detect the heat signatures of large animals from significant distances. But the Devil's Triangle had been keeping secrets for 80 years, and it wasn't ready to give them up to a team of investigators with fancy equipment and legal authority. The helicopters found nothing. The rocky terrain and dense forest cover made aerial surveillance nearly impossible, and the natural formations seemed to swallow radio signals and confuse electronic instruments. After 6 hours of intensive searching, the aircraft returned to base with nothing more than fuzzy images of trees and rocks. The ground teams fared even worse. The trails into the Devil's Triangle were barely wide enough for horses, certainly too narrow for the ATVs and other vehicles the search teams had brought. Within 2 hours, 3 investigators had suffered injuries ranging from twisted ankles to a concussion caused by a low-hanging branch. The tracking dogs seemed confused by the maze of scents and sounds, and several simply refused to continue when the trails became too dangerous. Jake Morrison, watching the search operation from a concealed observation post high in the rocks, felt a grim satisfaction as he saw the investigators struggling with terrain that he had known since childhood. But he also understood that his temporary advantage wouldn't last forever. Agent Wells was too smart and too determined to give up after one unsuccessful search. She would regroup, bring in more resources, and eventually find a way to penetrate his hiding place. "They'll be back tomorrow," Jake said to Sarah as they watched the last helicopter disappear over the horizon. "With more people, better equipment, and probably a lot fewer rules about how they go about searching." Sarah Morrison had spent the day moving between their hidden camps, checking on the cattle and making sure they had adequate water and shelter. The stress was showing on her face, but her voice remained steady and determined. "How long can we hold out?" she asked. "Depends on how far they're willing to go," Jake replied. "If they bring in enough people with enough equipment, they'll eventually find us. The question is whether we can make it expensive enough and difficult enough that Hartwell Corporation decides to look for easier targets." That night, Jake and Sarah made camp in a cave that his grandfather had shown him 40 years earlier. The cave was large enough to shelter a dozen people and their horses, with a spring of clear water and a natural chimney that would dissipate smoke from a small fire. More importantly, it was positioned so that Jake could observe all the major approaches to the Devil's Triangle while remaining completely hidden from outside view. They ate cold beans from cans and dried beef jerky, conserving their supplies and trying not to think about how long they might have to live like fugitives on their own land. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, a sound that had been the backdrop of their lives for 30 years but now seemed tinged with uncertainty and danger. "I keep thinking about the boys," Sarah said as they shared a cup of coffee heated over their small fire. "Michael's career could be destroyed if this gets too much publicity. And David, the bank won't keep him on if his father becomes a famous criminal." Jake had been wrestling with the same concerns, knowing that his decision to fight Hartwell Corporation would inevitably damage his children's futures. But he also knew that surrendering would mean the end of everything the Morrison family had built over 3 generations. "Maybe that's a chance we have to take," Jake said finally. "If we give up now, Michael and David inherit nothing but memories. If we fight and win, they inherit a ranch and a legacy. If we fight and lose, well, at least we'll know we tried." The second day of the search operation brought more investigators, better equipment, and a level of determination that made Jake realize he was facing an opponent that wouldn't give up easily. Agent Wells had called in favors from federal agencies, bringing in specialists who had experience tracking fugitives in wilderness areas and equipment that could detect hidden cattle from distances that seemed impossible. But Jake Morrison had advantages that no government agency could duplicate. He knew every trail, every hiding place, and every natural feature of the Devil's Triangle. More importantly, he had the help of people who had lived in this area for generations and understood that sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right, even when the law says he's wrong. Bobby Martinez, Jake's most trusted ranch hand, had volunteered to act as a liaison with the outside world, carrying supplies and information between Jake's hiding place and the network of neighbors and friends who quietly supported what he was doing. It was dangerous work that could result in serious criminal charges, but Bobby understood what the Morrison Ranch meant to the community. "There's a lot of people pulling for you, boss," Bobby reported during one of his clandestine visits. "Ranchers from 3 counties have been calling the sheriff's office, demanding to know why they're treating you like a criminal instead of going after the real criminals at Hartwell Corporation." The community support was more extensive than Jake had dared to hope. Local business owners were refusing to provide services to Hartwell Corporation's investigators. Ranchers were offering their own property as hiding places if Jake needed to move his cattle again. Even some law enforcement officers were privately expressing doubts about the priorities of an investigation that treated a respected rancher like a dangerous fugitive while corporate lawyers planned to destroy a family's legacy. But the most surprising support came from Jake's own sons. Michael arrived at the ranch on the 3rd day of the search with news that changed everything about the legal situation.
Dad, I've been doing research on Hartwell Corporation, Michael said during a hurried conversation conducted through Bobby Martinez as an intermediary.
They're not just trying to buy your land. They're running a sophisticated land grab operation that's been targeting ranchers across the West for the past 5 years. The information that Michael had uncovered painted a picture of corporate manipulation that made Jake's resistance look like a patriotic duty rather than criminal behavior. Hartwell Corporation had used combinations of legal pressure, political influence, and financial manipulation to force dozens of families off land that had been in their families for generations.
They've got a pattern, Michael explained.
First, they identify ranches in areas they want to develop. Then, they use environmental regulations, zoning changes, and tax assessments to make it financially impossible for the families to keep their land. Finally, they move in with offers that seem generous but are actually a fraction of what the land is really worth.
The legal implications were staggering.
If Michael could prove that Hartwell Corporation was engaged in a conspiracy to defraud property owners, Jake's actions might be seen as justified resistance rather than criminal behavior. It wouldn't make his current legal troubles disappear, but it might provide the kind of defense that could turn him from a fugitive into a folk hero. On the fourth night of the manhunt, Agent Wells made a decision that would escalate the conflict beyond anything Jake had imagined. Frustrated by her inability to locate the missing cattle despite intensive searches, she decided to force Jake Morrison out of hiding by targeting the one thing he valued more than his own freedom. "We're going to arrest Sarah Morrison as an accessory to her husband's crimes," Wells announced to Sheriff Bradley during a strategy meeting. "Once she's in custody, Morrison will either surrender or he'll try to rescue her. Either way, we'll have the confrontation we need to end this situation."
Tom Bradley felt his stomach drop as he realized what Wells was planning. Patricia, Sarah Morrison isn't a criminal.
She's a ranch wife who stood by her husband.
Arresting her isn't going to solve anything.
She's aided and abetted the concealment of assets worth millions of dollars, Wells replied coldly. That makes her a criminal, and criminals belong in custody. Besides, Morrison is clearly making decisions based on emotion rather than logic.
Threatening his wife might be the only way to make him surrender before someone gets hurt. The arrest warrant for Sarah Morrison was signed at dawn on the 5th day.
By the time the sun was fully up, Agent Wells was leading a team of federal marshals toward the Devil's Triangle with the intention of serving the warrant and forcing the final confrontation that would either end Jake Morrison's resistance or escalate it into something that nobody wanted to contemplate. High in his rocky observation post, Jake Morrison watched the approaching officers through binoculars and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. For 4 days, he had been playing a game of hide and seek with investigators who were following rules and procedures. Now those same investigators were coming after his wife, and the game was about to become something much more serious. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, turning to the woman who had shared every danger and every triumph of this desperate flight.
"They're coming for you."
Sarah Morrison looked at her husband with the kind of calm acceptance that comes from facing the inevitable.
"Then, I guess it's time to find out just how far we're willing to go to save our home."
The final confrontation between Jake Morrison and federal law enforcement came at dawn on the 6th day, but it didn't happen the way anyone expected. Instead of a dramatic standoff between desperate fugitives and armed officers, it began with a single gunshot that echoed across the Devil's Triangle like thunder, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Agent Patricia Wells was leading her team up the main trail toward the hidden valley where she believed Jake and Sarah Morrison were concealed when the shot rang out. Her first thought was that Morrison had decided to fight rather than surrender, and she immediately ordered her officers to take defensive positions behind the scattered boulders that lined the narrow trail.
"Morrison!"
Wells called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air.
"This is Agent Patricia Wells with the Montana Department of Justice. You're surrounded and there's nowhere to run. Come out with your hands visible and no one needs to get hurt." The response came from an unexpected direction. Instead of Jake's voice answering from the rocks above, Wells heard the sound of someone approaching from behind her on the trail. She turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley climbing toward their position, his face grim with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "Patricia, you need to call off this operation," Tom said when he reached her position. "Right now.
Before somebody does something we'll all regret for the rest of our lives." Wells kept her weapon ready and, her eyes on the rocks where she expected Morrison to be hiding.
Tom, this is a federal operation. Morrison is a fugitive who's been evading arrest for 5 days. I'm not calling off anything until he's in custody.
The shot you heard wasn't from Jake Morrison, Tom said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Wells finally look at him directly.
It was a signal. From Bobby Martinez.
Jake's been trying to surrender for the past hour, but your people have been moving so fast he couldn't get word to you without risking getting shot.
The news hit Wells like a physical blow.
For 5 days, she had been conducting an intensive manhunt, bringing in federal resources and treating Jake Morrison like a dangerous criminal. The idea that he might have been trying to surrender while she was preparing to arrest his wife was almost impossible to process.
Where is he?
Wells asked, finally, lowering her weapon but keeping her hand close to it.
Tom Bradley pointed toward a rocky outcropping about 200 yards up the trail.
He's waiting there with Sarah and all the cattle. All of them, Patricia. Every head that was reported missing. He's ready to turn himself in and face whatever charges you want to file. The walk up the trail to Jake Morrison's position was one of the longest of Agent Wells' career. She had been so focused on the technical aspects of the investigation, so determined to treat this as a straightforward case of asset concealment, that she had never really considered the human elements involved. Now, faced with the reality of arresting a man who had been trying to save his family's legacy, she found herself questioning everything about the way she had handled the situation. Jake Morrison stood in a small clearing beside the hidden valley, his hands empty and visible, his face showing the exhaustion of 5 days spent living as a fugitive on his own land. Beside him, Sarah Morrison maintained the kind of dignified composure that comes from facing the inevitable with grace and courage. Behind them, spread across the hidden valley, were the most beautiful cattle Agent Wells had ever seen. Nearly 700 head of prime breeding stock, all healthy and well cared for despite their unusual circumstances. The sight made it clear that whatever else Jake Morrison might be guilty of, neglecting his animals wasn't one of his crimes. Mr. Morrison, Wells said formally, though her voice lacked the hard edge it had carried during the manhunt. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, contempt of court, and concealment of assets.
You have the right to remain silent.
Jake listened to the Miranda warning with the patient attention of a man who had been expecting this moment for days.
When Wells finished, he nodded once and extended his hands for the handcuffs.
Agent Wells, Jake said quietly, I want you to know that I never intended to break the law. I was just trying to save something that my family has built over 3 generations. Mr. Morrison, Wells replied, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice, I understand why you did what you did. But, understanding doesn't change the fact that you broke federal law.
The arrest itself was anticlimactic.
Jake Morrison submitted to the handcuffs without resistance, kissed his wife goodbye with the calm acceptance of a man who had always known this day would come, and walked down the mountain trail flanked by federal marshals. The manhunt that had consumed the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies for 5 days ended with the quiet dignity of a man accepting the consequences of his choices. But, even as Agent Wells watched Jake Morrison disappear into the back of a federal prisoner transport vehicle, she knew that the arrest was only the beginning of the story, not the end. The case against Morrison would attract national attention, and the circumstances surrounding Hartwell Corporation's acquisition attempts would inevitably become part of the public record. She was right. Within 24 hours of Jake Morrison's arrest, the story had been picked up by national news networks. But, the narrative that emerged wasn't the simple tale of a criminal rancher that Agent Wells had expected. Instead, Jake Morrison became a symbol of the ordinary people who were crushed by corporate power and legal manipulation. The turning point came when Michael Morrison released the research he had been conducting on Hartwell Corporation's business practices. The evidence he had uncovered painted a picture of systematic fraud and manipulation that made Jake's resistance look like patriotic duty rather than criminal behavior. The legal documents showed that Hartwell Corporation had engaged in a pattern of targeting family ranchers across the West, using combinations of political pressure, environmental regulations, and financial manipulation to force them off land that had been in their families for generations. The Morrison Ranch was just the latest target in a scheme that had already destroyed dozens of family operations. More damaging to Hartwell was the revelation that they had been working with corrupt county officials to manipulate property assessments and zoning decisions. The environmental violations they had claimed to discover on the Morrison Ranch were fabricated, part of a systematic campaign to create legal justifications for forced acquisitions.
The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Ranchers from across Montana organized protests demanding that charges against Jake Morrison be dropped. Local businesses announced boycotts of any Hartwell Corporation projects. Even politicians who normally avoided controversy began calling for investigations into the corporation's business practices. But the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. Harrison Hartwell himself, the corporation president who had threatened Jake Morrison with financial ruin just weeks earlier, requested a private meeting with federal prosecutors to discuss a resolution to the situation. The meeting took place in the federal courthouse in Helena, with Jake Morrison present in handcuffs and orange prison jumpsuit. Hartwell arrived in his usual expensive suit, but his demeanor was markedly different from the confident executive who had visited the Morrison Ranch. The man who sat across the table from Jake looked tired, defensive, and perhaps even slightly ashamed. "Mr. Morrison," Hartwell began, his voice lacking the smooth confidence Jake remembered, "I want to apologize for the way this situation has developed. When I authorized the legal action against your ranch, I was operating under information that I now know was incomplete and possibly fraudulent." The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Carson, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Hartwell, are you saying that your corporation was given false information about the Morrison Ranch?" "I'm saying that certain members of my legal team may have misrepresented the facts about environmental violations and zoning issues," Hartwell replied carefully. "I'm also prepared to admit that our acquisition strategy may have been more aggressive than was appropriate or legal." The negotiations that followed lasted for 3 days and resulted in an agreement that surprised everyone involved. Hartwell Corporation would drop all claims against the Morrison Ranch and pay substantial damages for the legal and emotional distress they had caused. In exchange, Jake Morrison would plead guilty to a reduced charge of interfering with a court proceeding, serve 6 months of house arrest, and agree not to pursue civil lawsuits against the corporation. More importantly, Hartwell Corporation agreed to cooperate with federal investigators looking into their business practices across the West. The information they provided would eventually lead to criminal charges against several corrupt county officials and the exposure of a land acquisition scheme that had been operating for nearly a decade. Jake Morrison was released from federal custody on a cold Thursday morning in April, exactly 3 weeks after his arrest. Sarah was waiting for him in the courthouse parking lot, along with his sons, Sheriff Tom Bradley, and what appeared to be half the population of Glacier County. The ride back to the ranch was a triumphant procession that stretched for miles along the county highway. Ranchers, neighbors, and friends lined the road to wave and show their support for a man who had become a symbol of resistance against corporate bullying and government overreach. When Jake finally stood once again on the porch of the Morrison Ranch house, looking out at his cattle grazing peacefully in their familiar pastures, he felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet satisfaction. The Devil's Triangle had kept its secrets for one more generation, and the Morrison Ranch would survive to be passed on to his sons and their children. Was it worth it? Sarah asked as they stood together watching the sunset paint their land in shades of gold and red. Jake Morrison considered the question carefully, thinking about the 3 weeks he had spent in federal custody, the legal bills that would take years to pay off, and the stress that had aged both of them by what felt like years. "Ask me again in 20 years, he said finally, "when our grandchildren are riding these same trails and working this same land." But, privately, Jake Morrison already knew the answer. Sometimes a man has to take a stand for what's right, even when everyone tells him to stop. Sometimes the most unexpected choice is the only choice that lets a person live with themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, doing what everyone says is wrong turns out to be the most right thing a man can do. The Morrison Ranch remains in the family today, operated by Jake's sons and their children. The Devil's Triangle still keeps its secrets, though the younger generation has added solar panels and satellite internet to the hidden valleys where their grandfather and great-grandfather once hid cattle from tax assessors and corporate lawyers. Harrison Hartwell's corporation collapsed under federal investigation 18 months after the Morrison case was resolved.
Hartwell himself served 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, while the land acquisition scheme he had operated was dismantled and dozens of families received compensation for property that had been stolen through legal manipulation. But perhaps the most important legacy of Jake Morrison's desperate stand was the message it sent to ordinary people facing overwhelming odds. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what everyone tells you not to do, and sometimes that's also the most necessary thing you can do. In the end, Jake Morrison's choice to ignore every warning and defy every authority proved that courage, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for what's right can still triumph over money, power, and political influence. It's a lesson that the American West has been teaching for over a century, written in the lives of ordinary people who refuse to accept that bigger always means stronger. The rancher did the unexpected, and, in doing so, he saved not just his own family's legacy, but reminded an entire nation that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost.